Can you guess what time is it? It's that time again of the year when Redditors aggressively attack daylight savings, while everyone else who actually has a life ends up having to deal with sleep deprivation for the rest of the week. Just a while ago, the time moved forward by an hour in North America. This bi-yearly international holiday is celebrated with fierce debates about whether this practice should be abolished and why. But let's talk seriously for a little bit. It's very easy to get carried away with daylight savings and get angry and frustrated over it. The thing, however, is that without having concrete and specific reasons and arguments, it's impossible to have a reasonable discussion about it. And without that, no higher up will have any good reason to consider abolishing daylight savings or even talking about it. This is the purpose of the video. As someone who, much like everyone else, doesn't like changing time zones twice a year, I want to be able to give substantial arguments regarding the subject, with hopes that a proper solution will be achieved sooner than later. Let's start by establishing the purpose of daylight savings. It began over a century ago. The reason why it became so prominent around the world was due to the Industrial Revolution, which resulted in factories and stuff with long, fixed scheduled work hours. But if it's dark, that means that there needed to be artificial lighting working, so it made sense to try to set up a schedule that matches the sun the best. The problem is that the further north or south you go from the equator, the more daylight length begins to vary between summer and winter. You don't want people to start working in pitch black nights, and you don't want people to waste precious summer mornings sleeping, right? So, the solution is quite ingenious when you think about it. Instead of dealing with the bureaucratic mess of changing schedules everywhere, just change the clock twice a year. Problem solved, right? Well, the issue is that things are different today. The most important aspect is energy efficiency. With the advent of fluorescent and LED lamp technology, energy consumption in lighting has been drastically reduced. In fact, LEDs of today consume roughly 10% the amount that incandescent lighting did. Not only that, but energy production has become more efficient and as a result cheaper and cleaner. This means two things. For one, it becomes much less justifiable to save an hour worth of lighting, even if it's in millions of buildings. And secondly, it entices people to be more wasteful when it comes to light. Although it's obviously not a good thing, it means that it might not even have any effect to try to save daylight. Go visit your neighborhood at night and notice all the houses that have their exterior lights on 24/7, the street lights, the traffic lights. Hell, all the car headlights, your phone screen, all of that doesn't pop out of thin air, right? But there's another issue that is also very significant. Things like air conditioning may actually worsen energy consumption during daylight savings as a result of people being awake longer during hot summers. This obviously doesn't apply to everywhere, but in hot deserts such as the state of Arizona, it was one of the main reasons that resulted in the removal of DST. As I've established just a while back, the purpose of daylight savings becomes more established in areas where there is a significant shift in the length of the day between the summer and winter solstice. In areas that are close to the equator, the difference is negligible, and thus daylight savings is fundamentally useless. As of today, the country closest to the equator that uses DST is Fiji, or at least the closest that I can actually find on a map, which is located roughly 18 degrees south. Before we continue further, I'd like to clarify something very important, and that is the definitions of various types of twilight. You'll see them often on this map, which by the way is from a website titled TimeAndDate.com, which is a great resource for this sort of thing. Civil twilight is effectively like an overcast day, and as a result I calculate them together. Astronomical twilight is also just marginally brighter than nighttime, so likewise I count the two as one. Going back to Fiji, the length of the day in June, aka winter, is just under 12 hours, whereas in December, aka summer, is roughly 14 hours. A laughable 2-hour difference. Keep in mind this includes sunset and sunrise, thus each of them only has a 1-hour difference. Which interestingly enough makes sense in principle, since sunrise occurs at roughly the same time in winter and summer, but this is offset by the fact that such a small difference may not even be noticeable by most people, rendering the whole thing pointless. But okay, we get it. Most countries close to the equator figure this out already and scrap DST. But what if I told you that the opposite is much more of a problem? I'll explain why. Let's start with the fundamental principle of conserving daylight, hence the name daylight savings. The bare minimum recommended sleep time for a healthy adult is 7 hours a day. And look, I know tons of people suffer from sleep deprivation, that's not the issue here. The point is, based on that assumption, it means there are 17 hours in a whole day. Which leads to the following point. Why would you ever need to preserve daylight if there are more than 17 hours of sunshine in a day? And that of course ignores the fact that people probably want to spend at least a good bit of time past sunset before going to bed. Very conservatively, that means that at any latitude higher than 47 degrees, daylight savings might be fundamentally useless, at least during the summer solstice. Interestingly, this coincides somewhat with the threshold where there is no longer true night during summer. A rather tame example is Vancouver. For the whole month of June, there is no true night. If by my own standards we consider astronomical twilight as a nighttime, then that leads to roughly only 4 hours of darkness. In that scenario, can you honestly tell me that you wished you could have more sunlight during summer? It's already ridiculous, but it gets worse. Remember how I mentioned that Fiji, which is located 18 degrees south, has a 1 hour delay between sunrise in the summer and winter solstice, making it potentially perfect for a 1 hour DST? Well, what do you think the delay is at 30 degrees, 40, 50, 60? Let's take an extreme example. Oslo, located 60 degrees north. It has effectively no night at all for 2 months. But more significantly, look at the green line designated DST. After the time jump, it takes a merely 2 weeks for the sunrise time to come back to what it was prior to the change in clocks. The point is, for the sunrise to happen at the same time on both solstices, you would need to move the clocks by 7 hours. Thus, daylight savings is not even a matter of debate. It is physically, objectively, indisputably useless at those locations. There has been numerous studies that prove that sleep deprivation is a serious issue immediately after the clocks switch, in particular when they move forward in spring, which results in increased car accidents, heart attacks, as well as general loss of productivity. Considering how bad sleep deprivation is in general within our society, it really isn't wise to mess around with it further. Apparently, there's also depression and suicide issues that could be caused by time changes. Aside from that, daylight savings is just overall inconvenient in all ways possible. Keeping track of the dates on which the switch occurs and going around the house changing every clock is a complete nightmare, and it could cause confusion. Furthermore, time zones, which are already a bit of a pain in the ass to keep track of, are even more of a nightmare to deal with. The difference between two time zones might change numerous times throughout the years due to different dates and hemispheres, making communication harder than it needs to be. In countries like Australia, there might be as many as 5 time zones during summertime. It's worth noting also that the length of the day changes gradually, not drastically. DST functionally assumes that the solstices are the only days that matter and ignores the massive annoyances that come as a result of sudden time shifts. The point is, it's a mess. As far as I'm aware, daylight savings isn't really supported by many people for its underlying purposes and only really exists as a sort of historic status quo. While businesses typically favor clock changes, these days it might only be in order to align with other regions or to better accommodate people's schedules, which might simply be used to the clock changes. Most pragmatic reasons are typically rather insignificant and don't really make much sense, as I've discussed previously. The good news is that it seems that people are starting to get the idea. In polls, typically over 90% of respondents want to end time changes, and we've seen continuous political progress to end the practice in numerous places. Europe has passed a law that will effectively ban DST in a few years. Whether it'll work out well or not is yet to be seen, and the US has numerous states with constant pushes to move to a permanent time zone. Likewise, here in Canada, the territory of Yukon has just announced that the current time change will be the last, and that it will stay on permanent summertime. If there is enough effort to remove DST in a couple states and provinces, then it will push the others into following. It may take time and effort, but with enough dialogue and reasonable discussion, I believe it is very realistic to come up with a solution. I should mention one last thing, which is about the really strong interest in adopting permanent summertime as opposed to permanent standard time. The idea is that the evening hours are the most important and that the later the sun sets, the better. While I would personally choose that over changing clocks twice a year, I can't exactly say that this is a good idea. There have been multiple studies that prove that accurate morning hours are crucial for a person's health, and a permanent summertime is a terrible thing during winter. I'll also add to the fact that the entire purpose of hourly time zones is to be as close as possible to solar time. Thus, permanent summertime is just the equivalent of being in the wrong time zone. If light evenings was such a real problem, then people would eventually shift schedules to better match the sunlight. Permanent summertime isn't the stupidest thing in the world though. For one, it may help this tourist season if it's close to areas that follow daylight savings, and may be a decent compromise in certain circumstances. But in the end, I'd say stick to the closest time zone. Anyway, that was an interesting video to make. I hope I was able to enlighten you at least a little bit. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this. Any suggestions, comments, or questions, feel free to express yourself in the comments. In any case, thank you very much for sitting through my worthless ramblings, and I'll see you, I don't know, eventually, I think.